You certainly are familiar with location based applications, or have at least heard of them. They're used to precisely locate assets, machines, individuals in or out of buildings, using a lot of IoT devices and sensors for that. Among all these applications, the ones that really stand out and frankly really add value are the ones that don't just do observations of things on a map. They are the ones that allow automation and integration into workflows. Location does matter, and we will discuss why with Paul on this new episode of the IoT Show. So, Paul comes from the world of air traffic control, and he's an entrepreneur passionate about using IoT and location based services for innovating in the world of healthcare. He even came up with the concept of care traffic control. Guess where that's coming from? Well, don't forget to subscribe to stay up to date on all things IoT, and give us a little like if you appreciate the conversation today. Eventually, give us also a little comment to share your perspective. Hi everyone, this is the IoT Show. I'm Olivier, your host. Thanks for tuning in. We will talk about location in IoT scenarios, location in different places. And the question that we will ask and try and answer today is why where matters. And you'll see exactly why we're putting this sentence together. And for that, we have Paul. Paul, how are you?
I'm great. Thanks.
Well, thanks for your time. Thanks for joining us. Where are you based? Are you on the East Coast of the U.S.?
I'm in Detroit.
Yeah, well, maybe it won't be surprising for people that you are in that city where there's a lot of cars built,
Right.
and you're working in the realm of location. So before we get into that, there's an even more interesting anecdote about yourself, which is your background. You're coming from air traffic control. Is that correct? Tell me about your background.
I am. We talked about this before. It's a bit of a connect the dots stories. I spent the first 10 years of my career as an electrical engineer doing systems engineering for Westinghouse, and eventually I was in the FAA. I was in the FAA for 7 years. And I was mostly a radar guy doing distributed systems, with what you can imagine in the FAA is very much on a macro scale. And at the end of the time that I spent in the FAA, I was lucky enough to get assigned a project where we distributed webcams around the state of Alaska for weather observation. And that really got me hooked on the internet and software in general. So I started working as a consultant. I left the FAA and ended up along the way in healthcare. I was working on a web-based project for digitizing an electronic medical record for Henry Ford Health System, and this was back when IT used to build products, right? And mostly, of course, they were custom. And eventually, Henry Ford bought Epic, which is the leading electronic health record, and that really signaled the end of IT building custom products. So I wanted to build something. I really wanted to stay in that space. I wasn't ready to, jump into the vendor space and do electronic medical records. I was interested in some other things. So, but I didn't know healthcare really well enough, I think, to create anything novel or new. And so I ended up getting a master's degree in health informatics. And really, for me, the purpose was to learn more about the industry in that space. And find a place to focus that energy. And at the time I saw mobile. That was around the time when the iPhone was released, and they were talking about what a revolution that these mobile devices was going to be. And and I should, back in the intro, I'm an engineer, a tech entrepreneur, now the content creator, but I've done a few Ironman races, and I like to bike and run. And so I kind of had that exposure to location-based services through, the toys that they have for that, right? I'm sure you're familiar with those.
Yeah.
So anyway, now I'm looking at apps, and I taught myself to code. And then in 2015, Apple came out with the iBeacon. And these beacons were out there that you could actually find the range on, and it's obviously that's IoT on these mobile devices. So I built an app that I could track the laps in a pool and track the laps in an indoor gym. So that was kind of my way of learning the space. And we never wasn't anything that I was planning on commercializing because I really just wanted to learn
Hmm.
um, about IoT. And again, I'm trying to find a place to put that creative energy. And I got connected with the Henry Ford Innovation Institute, and they had a program to help employees become entrepreneurs, right, and commercialize healthcare products. And around that same time, Henry Ford had a huge account with Apple, and because you have a huge account, of course, you can get connections to some of the inside things that are going on at Apple. And in 2014, we were able to be a part of their beta project for what is now called Apple Indoors. And
Hmm.
what that allowed us to do was to track mobile devices inside the building using only the signals from the Wi-Fi, right? And you could get, we did this in a 3 million square foot building, and I have traces where you could see, which side of the hall you're on, right? So it worked really well. And you're thinking, my gosh, we have indoor GPS, right? And
Yeah.
at very little cost. And so now I'm feeling like we got something here. We
Mhm.
need to build a product around that. So Apple was really interested in doing this with wayfinding, so directing people and patients around the building. But what I saw and what we saw was the operational side of this. What can we do to track what's moving in the hospital? And this is where this spark of a idea around the idea of care traffic control really started, to come to the front. Is that we have indoor GPS. One of the key, and sometimes they'll even call it the lifeblood of the hospital, is moving patients around, patient transport. Right, it becomes a bottleneck when patients don't get to the services that they need, on time.
Mhm.
And so the Innovation Institute, of course, in their role, was able to connect us with this business problem. Right, so we have this technology, now we have the business problem. And so we started looking at, how do we, and these guys were already carrying iPhones. Epic had an app where you track their job. So we used that to create observation around where the patient transporters were and then allow the dispatchers through situational awareness to be able to fix the problems and reduce those bottlenecks, right? But it's strictly observation versus, any kind of automation.
Mhm.
And that was what we commercialized, right? And so, with through the help of the Henry Ford Innovation Institute, we were able to do that. But
Okay.
one of the thing that when you in the entrepreneur side, you still have this balance between some of the politics that you would have with a small startup and a big company, right? So how do you negotiate that? And that's really part of the job of the Innovation Institute. But I was lucky enough, and this is where the IoT starts to come in, in a big way for me, was that Henry Ford bought that 3 million square foot campus that we had the Apple Indoor Positioning work. They did that entire campus with a highly um, location aware RTLS system, right?
Mhm.
So it was a big implementation, and it was again, this idea where we're gonna uh, cover the building as much as we can with this location fidelity, so that people can find things through observation. And so, but one of the things that they saw is that they had all these other different RTLS systems, and the integrator was pitching this idea that you can do this turnkey. We can help you, right? You can implement the system, and then we're going to come in and solve your problems. Well, the turnkey in location services, and this was kind of this, for me, the aha was that that's a struggle. So I made a pitch for them to create an internal entity in IT to focus on location-based services, and they went with it, right? So now I'm an entrepreneur. I also have my role being IoT, and we had plenty of use cases, right? That we were doing. We were doing duress. We were doing asset management. We were doing rounding. We were doing all these location-aware use cases, and then, our challenge was to get ROI out of that, right,
Mhm.
from internal. And
Yeah.
so that fuels, I think, a lot of what we can talk about here in a minute on
Exactly.
how we were able to do that. But So kind of picture, we have this indoor GPS. We are able to track transporters. They're moving around the building. They're kind of passengers, right? And what do you call this thing, right? And people were calling it Uber for patient transport, and that was cute, and we kind of liked that. But I kind of took a step back and I said, this might even be bigger than this idea of Uber for patient transport. And with my background, I thought care traffic control. Well, I thought I was clever, and then I figured out this clever little term and found out that it was, already been coined. But what hadn't happened is nobody had actually built any kind of proof point around that, right?
Mhm.
So for us, that was really the goal. How do we start to make this a thing, right? How do we make this idea, care traffic control, come into reality, but bigger than just moving patients around the hospital. And now we have the IoT piece of it. So I like to look at things like people, property, and places. So
Mhm.
if you have people and property, right now you're starting to get into the actual systematization and mechanization around things that, and this is where that spark of automation starts to come into play. So that kind
Okay.
of gets us to care traffic control. That's my kind of long-winded connect the dots story.
That's okay, and that's a lot to unpack. So we'll unpack some of that today. That's perfect. One thing you didn't go to though, and I want to ask you.
Yeah,
So you hooked me up by reaching out, and the term that really grabbed my attention was the term "why where matters." That's a website. That's a newsletter. Tell me more about that. Well, you talked a lot about the inception of where you're at today,
right.
but I'm curious to know that term "why where matters." I think some people might react to that question saying, well, yes, knowing where my things are is important, but it
Mhm.
goes beyond that. So what is why where matters exactly?
Yeah, so we did commercialize some of the workflow automation, and
Mhm.
but the vision was for something bigger. And we didn't quite get the runway to get the proof point in care traffic control. And one of the things that's a challenge when you're doing anything novel, especially in a space like healthcare, and it really starts to surface when we talk about things like the digital twin, is the market awareness. And I could one-on-one talk with people about care traffic control, and there's an immediate excitement about it, right? Just in the phrase, because people want, just like you were saying, they want to unpack it and see where it can take us. But they're just like when I was very new to the digital twin, I didn't understand what it was, and then when I started to see some of the way that the documentation showed the concept that there's really some real detail behind this, I knew that care traffic control needed that same level of detail, definition, conceptualization. And so I started working on, my own way to present that, out and start to get feedback and learn more about, its fit within the market. We're even, the feedback that I got, Olivier, often was this is bigger than just healthcare, right?
Yes.
So, and this is where you and I were talking about this idea of abstraction, right?
Mhm.
And how do you abstract things? Because at higher levels of abstraction, you get the sameness that comes out of that, right? So the why where matters is really around let's add some definition to care traffic control. Let's get the word out of what it is. Let's get feedback. Let's, maybe get the sparks of a knowledge base established, right? And that's why opportunities like this are a really big deal.
That makes sense. And so we'll invite people towards the end to sign up for the newsletter or contribute by commenting, proposing ideas. To me, innovation is a lot about community engagement and the ability to work together, right? Standards, this kind of forums where you can propose your ideas, react to others. So that's perfect. So traffic control is a term that people understand. Air traffic control, people understand how critical it is to make sure that the hundreds of people are in the plane don't get injured or die because there are some issues in synchronizing planes landing and taking off and whatnot. And so people really understand that it goes beyond just knowing where the planes are. It's not just about understanding when it's going to come. It has an impact on the schedule of the airport, on the delays on all the other planes. There's a lot of money involved. There's like liability involved and so on. I think that I like the term care traffic control because it does convey that notion of criticality, of importance. Also conveys the idea of, there is something beyond just a location, and that's really what we're looking at. We're looking at using that location information to do more. But what are the similarity between your early background in air traffic control with FAA and healthcare? What are the things that
Right.
you thought that made you reflect and think, I don't know, wait a second, I can apply what I know from this domain to this one, and this has not been tried or approached this way. So what are
Right.
the commonalities here?
Right. For sure. And just when you think about both, right, air traffic control and healthcare, you have patients, you have passengers, you have hospitality, right? Hospitality is even the root of what you see in hospital. And in airlines, they have what they call above the wing, which is where you interact with your customers, right? And that becomes a very important thing around location. Then you start to dig deeper into the operations, and then you start to look at there's all these support services, and that's why really when we do care traffic control, we start with the support services. There, in from COVID, I think people got a sense of how important supply chain was, right? Especially in healthcare. And so you have supply chain, you have housekeeping, you have food services, you have device management, you have safety and security protocols. Those are all these support services that are, very much the same in these areas. But then even beyond that, right? These things that are very alike. There's so much motion that goes on. When I worked in location-based services at the hospital, I used to inventory the workflows. Like I would learn, I saw this idea of workflow automation, as being the future. And I would, you could stand in the hospital, and I used to do this. I used to stand in the hospital and just kind of look at people moving around the hospital and think about what they're doing. And when you know the operations, you start to get a sense of this isn't, they aren't just going to lunch. They're out there doing, moving to be a part of those operations. And then when we started dealing directly, like especially when we work with patient transport, we could see all the pitfalls that go into trying to coordinate that motion. And, it was very complex.
Mhm.
And that was just one, that was just one workflow. And we knew these workflows, were happening over and over again. And so, now you're looking at the workflows. Well, now we look at the technology, and you think about air traffic control. We have all these sensors. We have ground sensors for detecting airplanes that are moving around in the airport. We have radar systems that just guide the airplanes into the airport, right? Then you have radar systems that are just for the routes, right? And then you have collision avoidance systems. There's so much automation and technology. And again, like I said, it's on this very much macro scale. But, that's where I got excited, in this connect the dots story is I'm looking at an iBeacon and things like a radar, right? I mean, it can do it this, with what's been done with miniaturization of these electronics, it's just a micro version of the things that we did on a macro scale. So, all the pieces are there. It's it's exciting to be able to put it together.
Awesome. So you're basically touching on a lot of things again here. One of the things you've been mentioning several times is value ROI, looking at really what these solutions that are based on location information can bring. You're leading towards this notion of automation of workflows based on location information and more. Are you seeing solutions today that are based on location lacking some of that, next step? What do you think these solutions, where do you think these solutions are at today? And what would you recommend, people look into to make them more, efficient, more productive, more useful?
All right, 100%. So again, having been a customer of location-based services and then, a vendor, we knew, we saw the gap was around not so much I want to know where an IV pump is, but what's happening with that IV pump? Is it
Mhm.
going to be cleaned? Is it going to be stocked? Is it going to be serviced? Is it going to be used on a patient? And each one of those, pieces has a different persona, a different user experience, and a different position in this flow, right? And what happens is if you start out with just this observation, what you tend to want to do is to create a huge amount of observation, a huge amount of location fidelity, a huge amount of telemetry that costs a lot of money. So
Mhm.
coming back to what we were talking about ROI, that was really the first thing that I saw. How do you pair that back to what's necessary in order to get the outcomes that you want from those workflows? Well, first, you have to know the workflow, right? And then you establish the telemetry for that workflow. But what you find is that when you're focused just particularly on that workflow, you're using far less technology than you needed when you're trying to, to do something on a much, larger scale.
Makes sense. Makes sense. So definitely, in what you were mentioning right now, definitely a need for identifying the ROI. But then, well, you're basically taking the problem from the end, right? So what is it that we're trying to achieve, and then pile up the data you need, and then use it correctly so that you're not overwhelmed by the amount of technology. But it requires more than just location data, right? Because you're starting to talk about mix and matching data that is coming from maybe the system itself, its health, its behavior, its logs, and then you'll start integrating with data that is people's management data from HR, from the CRM as well, if there is one, because you want to have interaction with the data from the customer or the patient in the case of care traffic control. So
Right.
you need to mix and match all that data, and we'll talk about the mental model you have describing different blocks of an application like that. But before we get there, I'm curious to know, what are the challenges you've seen, you faced in your experience having to put together all that data from different sources. It seems to be a lot, and so I'm really curious about what are the struggles that you faced, that you've seen customers having when trying to build this kind of solutions.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. So again, when we talk about automation and we talk about the workflows, we know the workflows aren't going to be built into a care traffic control system, right?
Mhm.
They're going to come from an external core system like the electronic medical record. And that's why what you see in the market right now, because of the difficulty with the interoperability with some of these systems, is that the focus is on observation. And when we built our system, we were focused on just provide me the location of those patient transporters, and then we're going to be able to see both the transporter and the jobs that they're working on, and then make a correlation. And so, this and actually this gets to kind of a proof point. One of the things that we did when we did that at one of the hospitals was that we had, observing transporters and moving around the building. You can see them like maybe, you can picture Strava or some sort of tracking app, with a floor plan. You can see exactly where they are in the building. You have that observation. Those same transporters were moving specimens around the building. So they would go to particular pickup locations and they grab the specimen and they put them in a container, and then they move to the next spot and they go, until they had to drop them off at the lab. Well, we found out, that they were losing these from time to time, and what a huge problem it was. Well, the observation wasn't good enough for them to be able to solve that problem. So you're talking about the integration. We actually built this without any integration. We just had those jobs
Mhm.
into the product so that you could see, in using IoT, each pickup location, the exact time that they got there, when they got there, right, and the trace, and connected that all together. They stopped losing samples with that observation, but now it's connected to a workflow and some
Mhm.
automation, right, with the ability to be able to recognize those arrivals and departures. So that really was, a kind of a smaller proof point around the kind of things that you can do with even this idea of track and trace inside of a building, right? Now, the way that I see it is that their challenges with interoperability come from the idea that what they're trying to make interoperable, something very specific, and it might not align with what you're building. Okay. So that's where if you can build something and get a proof point out there and then they can see the value in it, then they're going to start, these core systems are going to start to look at that and say, how do we connect to that?
Hmm.
And so that's really, I think, the way that you grow this organically is that you create this care traffic control system. You start to see, you do the observation, you do
Yeah.
some automation, right? Do as much automation as you can, and then work your way outward. And then you look at the rest of the ecosystem, right? Because the ecosystem could be electronic health record, it could be the ERP, it could be, could be any kind of job management, security, disasters, all these different pieces are going to
Hmm.
start to get interested in this telemetry that you've created, and then you can start to coalesce around this idea of a command center.
Yeah, and interoperability is going to become even more important than ever, and you will need to have infrastructure to regroup all that data, to collect the data, to filter it out, to create models that you will be able to interact with, ingest real-time data versus historical data, apply analytics on that, and then do something out of it. That's interesting because there's a lot of parallels with the world of of the industry of industrial automation. Industrial IoT is definitely a thing where conversation these days are a lot about unified namespace. How do we, how do we normalize the data that is coming from different sources, existing like brownfield, new type of solutions, greenfield? Things are becoming more and more connected, and so that's a big huge mess, to be clear. And people are having a hard time defining or identifying really what the value is, what the return over a huge investment in making sense of all of that data it really is. And so that's interesting. You started in your case from the ROI, from the value, which is I believe the only way to go. And you ended up piling up technology, realizing that it could extend, it had ramifications, and you saw opportunity to go beyond. But you're still in a place that is very complex, and you needed to create a mental model of these different pieces to rationalize them and to be able to interact with these different entities you were talking about that could be interested in care traffic control, and how to interact with it and how to access the data and how to leverage it. Can you tell us a bit more about this mental model? How do you see care traffic control if you had to simplify it? What are the big buckets? What are the big blocks you would draw on a diagram to
Right,
describe it?
right. No, that's a great topic. So, and it goes back to when I said I kind of discovered the digital twin, and then saw that it was a virtual representation of a physical object with that's updated in real time. Right? It's a short, compact definition. But if I compared that to my initial perceptions on what the digital twin was, I would have told you it's a fancy map. Right? So now when I'm looking at care traffic control, I think it needed that same short, concise definition that you could unpack into all these different layers of abstraction, right?
Mhm.
So the definition that I'm going with is that it's situational awareness in automation to optimize mobile workflows across the enterprise.
Okay.
Okay. So when we think about situational awareness, that's more on the human side, like where our experience with the patient transporters has us with dispatchers that are able to look and see where people are at and then make those decisions and guide things and make sure that there's flow. But on the other side, on the automation side, now we have these sensors. We have, when we're breaking it down in layers of abstraction, underneath automation, I would put firmly the digital twin, because the digital twin starts to allow us to create an architecture around this technology, very much focused on automation,
Mhm.
also, but human in the loop, right? And so, a lot of the discussion and maybe even fear on AI is how do we interact with these machines? It becomes, more and more important. Well, as we start to look at the idea of agency and agents, then that will allow us to be able to define quite clearly the role of the human and the role of the machine in this operation. It could be, with an agent that the human is entirely in the loop, like our patient transport, it's all human. There's no automation. But I think with this abstraction around these agents, that's going to allow us to be able to drill down deeper and deeper and deeper and to get, down to the very specific things like events. You know, we were talking about location fidelity and some of the
Mhm.
challenges that go into trying to design that automation. Well, it's what is what's the location fidelity that you need to trigger an event or to do some of these things, right? It's not arbitrary. You need to
Yeah.
have precise timing, you need to have updates, all those things, right? So that idea of location fidelity and specifications, the only way you're going to really know is to create that abstraction and get down to the layer, say, this is exactly what I need out of my IoT, right? Is that fair?
Yeah, it is. It is. Now, I like this model of situational awareness on one side, automation on the other one, that leads to an actual value. And I like the way you're describing them in a big bucket, and then you're going to dive into to identify exactly how deep you need to go to specialize, to customize, versus leveraging the common version of it, or the generic version of it, of each layers of abstraction. Digital twin is a good example of a concept, but also a set of services that have been developed. Microsoft has one service that is called Azure Digital Twin. AWS, they have Twin Builder. You have other companies that really created their business around this notion of digital twin, developing them and so on. There's one thing that I'd like to add when I'm describing what digital twin is, besides just a digital representation of a set of people, things, and places. There's also the relationship between all the entities. So you create models, and then you establish a map of relations between these entities that could be these places, things, and people, and your ability now to interact with these models through AI, through alerts, rules, and so on, to generate automation, to create that automation that we're talking about, is really something you want to leverage, not reinvent, not rebuild, right?
Right.
But then you will need to go all the way down to, okay, but specifically for location, I need to have that type of fidelity, that type of precision. I need to correlate the actual location with the past information, with the mapping of the building, with which patient it is. Like, is it someone dying? They needs to be in an ER now, or is it a sample that should not go into a room that is over that temperature? And you're starting inventing these scenarios that are now easy to implement because you have models, and now you have graphs that will allow you to interact with a lot of data that has been organized around this notion of a digital twin, right?
Right. Right. 100%. And even to start, let's go back to the digital twin because some of these platforms that are out there are designing, again, you have layers of abstraction. We understand what the digital twin is, but when we get to that next layer, what is it trying to do? One of the things, like in buildings, we see this idea of building automation, and the building automation has this telemetry, and the telemetry is around conditions, right? The conditions of machines and doors and access and all these things. So it's about the building being a building, right? What we're doing on the air traffic control net on this side is the operational digital twin. So it's about what's going on inside that building, right? And they're totally related, right? We want all that condition information because the amount of inference and correlation that can be done becomes very, there's huge opportunities, in that kind of thing. Lights being on and off, doors being closed, all that starts to show what's going on in the building.
So this is why where it matters.
Yeah.
Really, it is why where it matters, for real. We could go on and on for hours. The other things that we not touched on is simulation and prediction, things that let me not get you started on that
Yeah,
because we could stay here for hours. But
we could.
Paul, I don't want to cut it short, but I want to definitely give time back to people and let them digest all what we just talked already.
Wonderful.
And ask you, so what's next step for people who want to understand exactly why, where it matters?
Again, so you started a newsletter. The newsletter really has kind of two approaches to it. One is sequenced, right? So we're building these topics, and like Olivier said, these terms come up in there, right? And it's just a short, page and a half around setting the context for each one of those. He explains what rational agents, the digital twin, maps it back to healthcare, and builds toward this definition of what air traffic control is. Then once we get there in the sequencing, then we're going to start to get deeper into specifics on the kind of thing that's done in a workflow. I am, and I think we said before that, we might not want to talk about it now that we're here. I do want to talk about it. We have a book that's going to be coming out it's going to go to the publisher in August, and it's really so. The idea around this book is to open source the idea of care traffic control to the degree that when you read it, I would hope, my expectation is that you're going to feel like you can kind of drive a system underneath it, right? It's going to drill down concepts all the way, to get to what kind of IoT is necessary, to create this kind of workflow, that kind of thing. That's really where we're going, with this idea of the book. So.
Yeah, definitely. Me too. I'm excited. And seeing IoT being used and leveraged to bring value, to help create these workflows, automate them, enrich solutions and systems for people's comfort, for efficiency, for productivity. I think it's awesome. Really excited. Paul, thanks a lot for your time today. Once again, there was a lot to unpack, and there's even more to unpack in the newsletter. We'll put the link down there. So people, sign up for the newsletter. Follow Paul as well on LinkedIn. I think there's a lot of interesting things coming up. And Paul, let's continue connecting the dots.
Thank you.
Awesome. Have a good one. Thank you.
Bye.